Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Caleb Bond. For the last time this week, well, let's take a look at tonight's top stories. Here's what's coming up on the program. Anthony Albanese's been a hero this week. He's alienated us from our allies by refusing to send a warship to the Red Sea, and now he's even been thanked by Hamas. Queensland Children's Hospital is under review after concerns over its gender care clinic. Rishi Sunak's leadership is hanging on by a thread in the UK as he faces another Tory revolt. And is Love Actually, the great Christmas movie, really sexist? We'll get into that a little bit later. Now, I know it's a few days before Christmas, it's the silly season, but I tell you what, been a few times this week I've wondered whether I've had too much to drink and become maybe a little too silly. I mean, I'm not sure if I've been living in Australia, let alone what side this country's on. If the Prime Minister's goal was to alienate all our allies and make friends with all our enemies, well, Mr Albanese, you've done a stellar job. I mean, we've been talking all week, of course, about whether or not we'd send a warship to the Red Sea to help the United States defend one of the world's most important trade routes against Iranian-backed pirates. As we now know, Defence Minister Richard Marles knocked back that request and instead opted to send a few more ADF personnel instead. Here he was talking to Kieran Gilbert yesterday.
To take a major asset and put it in the Middle East is to take a major asset away from what we're doing in the immediate region, in areas like the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and that would be a mistake.
Now, it's bad enough as it is. There are only two options here. Either we don't have enough boats or capable enough boats to send to the Red Sea, which would be an indictment on our defence capabilities, or we simply didn't want to help out the US, which is a brutal and bald-faced snub of one of our biggest allies. And lo and behold, the decision not to send a ship has been praised by the Chinese Communist Party. The Global Times, which is a CCP-owned newspaper, published an opinion piece by some dope called Jerry Gray, who wrote that Australia, quote, has finally stepped out of the US's shadow to call for a ceasefire and could potentially act as a mediator in the conflict if needed. That opportunity will be lost if it has a military presence in the region. It's sensible for Australia to continue distancing itself from the US. Gee, wonder why the CCP would want Australia to distance itself from the US. This piece also rubbished the idea that intervention in the Red Sea was required at all, saying that despite claims that Houthi rebels are attacking commercial vessels with ballistic missiles, the available information is that they cause no significant damage and no injuries and, quote, so far, no photos of damage have been offered as evidence, not one ship has been disabled and not one crew member lost. They clearly missed this video of the Houthis hijacking a ship and taking the crew hostage at gunpoint. One wonders whether maybe the fact they haven't seen that in China is because China won't let them see it. But, you know, they haven't been lost, so it's okay. These are the friends Anthony Albanese is making. And then you have his other new best mate, senior Hamas leader Ghazi Hamad, who is thrilled that Australia wants a ceasefire in Gaza.
The Hamas movement is watching the growing calls by several Western governments to end the aggression on Gaza, the last of which was the statement by Canada, Australia and New Zealand backing sustainable ceasefire in Gaza. We welcome these developments and consider them in the right direction toward isolation, the fascist Israeli government.
You certainly wouldn't want the PM to organise your references on your resume, would you? Now, that video is unverified, but Albanese took it seriously enough to publicly address it multiple times today.
I don't intend to give them anything other than the contempt that they deserve. They have my contempt. They're a designated terrorist organisation. My statement very clearly, along with the Canadian Prime Minister and the New Zealand Prime Minister, makes it very clear that Hamas should have no role in the future governance in Gaza.
I mean, all of this was quite predictable. Here we are, a nation in the West, openly and actively snubbing our allies, and our effective enemies are having a field day with it. I mean, calling for a ceasefire was a free kick to all the Jew haters who keep protesting in our cities, and a free kick to Hamas. They loved it, as we just saw. And don't forget that Albanese was the CCP's pick for Prime Minister. The Global Times, the CCP-owned newspaper I mentioned before, said that he, quote, positively shined compared to Morrison in the lead up to last year's federal election. Is it any wonder when his interactions with Xi Jinping go something like this? And I know I've already played this clip this week, but it's too good not to show again.
President Xi relayed stories about his visits to Australia, including we had an exchange about. He spoke about the Tasmanian devils as being cute animals in Australia. I pointed out that whilst I like Tasmanian devils, they're probably not as cute as pandas.
God help us all. Well, it's been an extraordinary week when it comes to anti-Semitism in Australia. You had the ABC sack Sydney Morning Radio fill-in Antoinette Lattouf for her long list of anti-Israel postings on social media. She's today filed legal action with the Fair Work Commission over her termination. Also at the ABC, you had them promoting boycotts of Israeli businesses on TikTok without any kind of critical thought or dissenting views.
Do you notice anything about this fridge? There's no Coke, Fanta or Sprite, and that's a very deliberate choice. Oz is one of many people taking part in the Palestinian-led boycott divestment scheme, which is a movement that lists brands that supporters of Palestinians are discouraged from buying from because they have some sort of tie to Israel, according to BDS. So it's hard to tell how much of a financial impact this movement makes on brands, but organisers say changing sentiment among customers is powerful in itself.
There was a school in Adelaide that painted a mural featuring the genocidal Palestinian chant from the river to the sea, which of course means eliminate Israel and the Jews. You had these numpties in Melbourne protesting against Christmas.
Idiots ruining Christmas.
But here is the pièce de résistance. The Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras has now written to the Prime Minister calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The people whose sexuality is outlawed in Gaza want a ceasefire. Joining me now to discuss this and more is Nick Cater, Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre. Now, in this letter, Nick, they write that they support actions that promote peace and the preservation of human life, and that Sydney Mardi Gras was born in 1978 by a brave group of activists that at their core were driven by the mission that every person should be treated equally and that we all have the right to live freely and safely. I mean, the irony is off the charts here.
I know, Caleb. I mean, you need to be a very brave activist to set up a gay liberation movement in Gaza under Hamas. I don't believe that there was a gay and lesbian Mardi Gras there, not as far as I know. I mean, in fact, to come out as gay in Gaza and indeed in the West Bank, although the situation isn't quite as bad there, is basically a death sentence because there's no, violence against homosexuals is condoned, and there are brutal examples of that. Whereas on the other hand, all the things that give Sydney such a vibrant and colourful gay and lesbian scene and the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras and all that sort of stuff, all that comes from the Western civilization, our belief in freedom, individual freedom, and our belief in tolerating people, providing they don't hurt anybody else. All those things are products of Western civilization, the very thing that Israel represents in that region. And these people apparently oppose that. It's no logic whatsoever. And if they had their way and Israel was pushed off the map, then that would be a very nasty place indeed for gay and lesbian people.
Oh, it's just utterly bizarre. I mean, Israel, every time they do a list of, the safest places for for gay people to live in the world. Israel's always in the top 10 list. It's one of the most liberal nations on earth. So the fact that these people would be, we need a ceasefire, we've got to protect Gaza, is just very strange. I mean, I know all of these pro-Palestinian people are very keen on boycotts. Well, I would say to people, boycott the Sydney Mardi Gras next year. I know there are lots of members of the gay community who are outraged by this, because it's like, for God's sake, you know, chickens don't vote for KFC and turkeys don't vote for Christmas, but queers vote for Gaza.
I was holding off using the turkeys don't vote for Christmas line because it's become a bit of a cliche, but I guess, well, it is December 22nd, so I'll let you get away with that one.
Exactly. Now, the ICC, the top cricket organisation in the world, has charged Usman Khawaja last night for wearing a black armband that he claimed was for personal bereavement. Now he's challenging the ICC for the right to show support for Palestinians on the cricket field. We remember he wanted to wear those shoes that said all lives are equal. Have a look at what he had to say today.
Being reprimanded for wearing a black armband, which the ICC asked me on day 2 what it was for. I told it was for a personal bereavement. I will be asking them and contesting that they make it fair and equitable for everyone. I don't have any agendas other than trying to shine a light on what I feel really passionately, really strongly about. I'm trying to do it in the most respectful way as possible. When I rode my shoes, I made sure that I didn't want to segregate different parts of the population, religious beliefs, communities, hence why I've kept religion out of this. When I'm looking at my Instagram and I'm seeing kids, innocent kids, videos of them dying, passing away, that's what's hit me the hardest.
So he says he wore the black armband for a reason of personal bereavement, but he did it directly after he was told he couldn't wear these shoes that had written on it in the colours of the Palestinian flags, all lives are equal. I mean, what is this personal bereavement? Does he seriously believe that the ICC and everyone else didn't think it was a statement about Palestine?
Well, he gave the game away, didn't he, when he said he gets his news from Instagram. That's his first mistake, right? That's not a good place to get balance. Look, this is probably a controversial statement to make on Sky News, but I think Instagram is even less reliable than ABC News.
Oi, blimey, Charlie. Well, if you're looking at, if you're looking at the ABC on Instagram, then it's like that's double trouble.
Oh, that is just hopeless. That is hopeless. But, you know, I mean, he gets his news from Instagram and he gets his understanding of history from slogans, basically. I mean, it's just slogan after slogan. I doubt that he's read much about the history of Israel, about the history of Palestine, about the nuanced, very nuanced morality of that world. You know, it takes a lifetime of reading to even begin to grasp a complex situation like Israel and Palestine. I doubt that he's done that. I doubt that he's done it. We don't expect him to. He's a cricketer, and we'd rather he just got on playing cricket, I think.
And he's very bloody good at it. Just stick to your knitting, mate. Now, I mentioned before this business about not sending a warship to the Red Sea. Peter Dutton has now lashed Labor for not sending it off. He said it takes a lot of effort with a special blend of weakness and incompetence for our Prime Minister to turn his back on our closest ally, a decision that could only be welcomed by Hamas, a listed terrorist organisation. I mean, surely you've got to know you're doing something wrong when Hamas puts out a video from one of its senior leaders saying, Australia, we salute you.
Well, there's a clue here, isn't there, Caleb, that Hamas and China have both celebrated this decision. And that shows that what Richard Marles and the Albanese government don't seem to get, that this is a joined-up problem. This is the axis of evil. Iran, Russia, and their proxies like China and so forth. China and their proxies like Hamas against civilization, basically, and we have to recognise that. And here's the thing: Richard Marles says, "Well, we can't send a ship there because we'd take attention away from what we've got to do in our own region." Sure, we've got to look after our own region. We've got to protect the South China Sea. But look, British and French ships are there with us. They send their ships out to help us protect the South China Sea because they know that we need international solidarity against this axis of evil. So that's exactly why we should be finding a ship, patching up the holes and getting it off to the Red Sea quick smart.
100%. And look, China doesn't seem to be too worried that we're hanging around to go into the South China Sea, do they? Nick Cater, Merry Christmas and thank you so much for your time, mate. Well, let's bring panel straight in now. Joining me is former Victorian Liberal President Michael Kroger, my good friend, former Liberal MP Nicole Flint. Now, Nicole, you've written a column today, controversial, some might say, calling the great Christmas flick Love Actually sexist. Now, I know you've upset a lot of people with this. I'm one of them. I mean, can't we just have some fun and watch a movie from 20 years ago and recognise it was from 20 years ago?
Caleb, I'm really concerned to call you my protege right now. I thought you were in full agreement with my analysis of this crime against Christmas. This film is a crime against Christmas. It's about time it was sent to the dustbin of film history. Look, Caleb, in 2003, I was doing my honours thesis. I got first-class honours. I thought women could do anything, and we can, because I went on to get elected to federal parliament, and I'm only one of about, 150 women who have ever managed that in Australian history. This film was released in that same year, and I just cannot believe there has not been more analysis of how sexist it is. There is not one single woman in this film in a senior role, demonstrating that women can have a successful career. It's all about blokes hitting on junior women in the workplace mainly. There's a young bloke who heads off to America and he's a bit of a creep, quite frankly, and hooks up with these 4 gorgeous American women. And then there's Keira Knightley's character, who is essentially stalked by her husband's best friend. It is an abomination. It should not be on the top Christmas movie list, Caleb. And I'm hoping that you and I can continue this discussion and I can explain to you further why this film is a crime against Christmas and it should be consigned to the rubbish bin of history.
Well, and look, it is probably fair to refer to me as a protege because, of course, Nicole, you did help me get one of my first writing gigs at the Advertiser when you were writing there. But, Michael, are you rushing out? Are you going to chuck Love Actually in the bin now?
No, I don't really care about Love Actually, to be honest. Although, boy, I've just heard Nicole, there must be something wrong with our society because it's one of the most popular Christmas movies of the last 20 years. So perhaps in Nicole's next article she'll explain why that is, Caleb. But otherwise, couldn't care 2 hoots, mate.
Well, look, we can have the discussion as well about whether Die Hard's a Christmas movie, I suppose, on and on that goes. Now, a terrorist who spent 8 years in jail plotting to kill police officers is set to be released from prison today. We haven't actually seen any vision yet of whether he is out, but just like Ibrahim Ghazawi, who was released last week, the Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus hasn't applied for any sort of continuing detention order. He hasn't applied for a supervision order for this bloke, Mohammed Al-Mui. So he's just out and about with no oversight, Nicole.
And we're seeing this again from federal Labor, aren't we? They were allegedly taken by surprise by the High Court decision when the High Court had been warning them for months. Everyone had been warning them for months. You cannot trust Labor on border security. You cannot trust Labor on keeping the community safe. But you can trust Peter Dutton, as we know. But Caleb, look at their track record. This happened when they were in power, when Gillard Rudd were in power. It happened when Chris Bowen was in charge of our borders. And it's happening now again under Claire O'Neill and the Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus. And it is just unacceptable. And I sincerely hope that Australians will keep all of this in mind, will remember that their safety was compromised by Labor when they get to the ballot box next time, because I tell you what, Peter Dutton will keep every single Australian safe. He'll keep our borders secure. He's got a proven track record. And I just hope we see an election sooner rather than later so we can get rid of this disastrous Labor government.
Michael, I sort of felt like bashing my head against a brick wall this week when I saw Dreyfus talking about Abdul Nasser Ben Brika, who, of course, was released with a supervision order, but they didn't go for further detention of him. And he kept saying, oh, well, you know, it's all Dutton's fault. We had to operate within the law. Well, you create the law. Why not change it?
Well, that's exactly right, mate, or request extensions. Look, you know, I was 18 when Whitlam lost office, and I thought to myself, I'll never see in my adult life a worse Prime Minister than Gough Whitlam, and along came Kevin Rudd. And then I thought after Rudd, I won't see anyone worse. But this bloke beats both of them. He is the worst Prime Minister I've seen in my lifetime, and my first election was back in 1969 as a 12-year-old. I handed out how-to-vote cards for John Gordon. I've never seen a bloke as bad as this. I think he's getting progressively worse. He's lost control of the borders. He's lost control of the immigration system. He's lost control of the matter he's been talking about, and then letting all the criminals, you know, not have extensions to their orders, releasing the 150 detainees when arguably he only had to release one because the case involving that person only related to that one person who they couldn't find another country to resettle. He's bad on detail. He's deserted Israel and the Jewish community. He's deserted them. But mate, at least he's been praised, as you said earlier, by Hamas. I mean, he is the first Australian Prime Minister in our history to be praised by a terrorist organisation. You know, the modern day Nazis are this mob, and this Prime Minister has been praised by them. And mate, you know, I saw that pathetic press conference he gave this morning where he said, I'm not going to pay any attention, Hamas, and their self-promotion. Well, that'll scare the living daylights out of Hamas, mate. The fact that Albo's not going to, you know, they will be themselves down there in Gaza. The thought that Albo's not going to let them use him. I mean, what a joke this bloke's become.
Oh, I know. He
is a train wreck of a Prime Minister.
God help us all, really, is all I can say. But, you know, strangely enough, he's still doing sort of OK in the polls. But I'll stick with you, Michael, because we know who's not doing so well in the polls. The latest Redbridge poll out of Victoria, Jacinda Allen's government has retained a 56 to 44 two-party preferred lead over the Libs. But how's this? The two-party preferred for every age group under 50 was in excess of 60% for Labor. I mean, how are the Libs ever going to win another election in your state, Michael?
Well, I think it's very difficult, and I've said this many times, I think it's very difficult to win public support when you don't release policies. And I'd encourage, you know, the members of the State Parliamentary Liberal Party to release policies. You know, I know there's this argument that in a 4-year term you're just criticised for the first year, but I've seen the way Dutton has been very strong on some policies. I mean, he's profoundly, courageous call early on in relation to the Voice when it was sort of going the other way. He's been very strong on all, you know, border issues, detention issues, law and order issues. You know, he's strong on immigration. I mean, Dutton, you know, he's now sort of talking about nuclear. I mean, Dutton's out there giving people a sense that this man's for the working middle class, and that is the majority of Australians. And I think the Victorian Parliamentary Liberal Party, if I could give them some advice, is you need to be out there for the working middle class Australians, and you need to start releasing some policies, and I think the sooner the better.
Here. Now, Nicole, just before we go very quickly, you wanted to give a shout out.
Oh, Caleb, I'm coming to you tonight thanks to my mum and dad and Elon Musk, actually. We just put in Starlink. But a wonderful local builder and all-round legend, Adrian Gibbs, who installed the internet for us. So that's how I'm coming to you from the farm. And I also want to say a big Merry Christmas to all of our wonderful viewers who have supported us so well at Sky this year. Thank you.
I'm glad we've got the telecommunications hooked up down there in South Australia. Michael Kroger, Nicole Flint, Merry Christmas to you both, and thank you for your time. Well, after the break, we'll speak to a senior psychiatrist who was axed from the very hospital now under review for the Agenda Care Clinic. But while you're waiting for that, I'll leave you with this thought. Is this the worst tattoo anyone has ever commissioned? Now, I don't know if it's actually real, but I saw it on Twitter. My God, it's Bruce Lerman's face, clearly. Imagine going to the grave with that thing shrivelling up on your arm. Don't go away. Well, gender transitioning for children has divided medical boards and communities across the globe this year, with the tide starting to turn against what is referred to as gender-affirming care. The NHS-run Tavistock Clinic in the UK is set to close next year, and here in Australia, the Queensland Children's Hospital's gender clinic has this month been put under official review after extreme concerns by senior health officials over their treatment approaches. Now, you probably haven't heard this anywhere else because the only person who's reported that this review is underway is independent journalist Bernard Lane. I recommend you look up his work. Now, when this idea of a review was first suggested by doctors in June, the hospital denied there was any need to look into things. And earlier this year, senior child and adolescent psychiatrist Dr. Gillian Spencer was asked to leave her role at the hospital for expressing concerns about the gender affirmation model the hospital had adopted, and now she's worried about what the government's review will actually achieve. Well, joining us now is Dr. Gillian Spencer. Gillian, welcome. You were, of course, as I said before, asked to leave your role at the hospital. You expressed concern about how things were going. Just tell us what happened there.
Sure, yeah. Well, my situation has turned into a little bit of a saga, but just briefly, last year I started raising concerns about the use of the affirmation model by the Queensland Children's Hospital because I became aware of the lack of evidence underpinning the model and also the serious harm to children from the affirmation pathway, which is social transition, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and gender surgeries. My concerns weren't well received by the hospital executive, and then suddenly in mid-April of this year, despite having worked for Queensland Health for 20 years with an unblemished professional record, I was suddenly removed from clinical duties on the basis of a single complaint of transphobia from a troubled adolescent. And then last month, my situation changed again because I was formally suspended by the hospital, and they've alleged that I've breached the code of conduct over 20 times by speaking publicly about my concerns regarding the harms to children from the affirmation model. So I've heard it loud and clear from the hospital that they don't want me speaking out about my concerns, but it's a real ethical dilemma because I know there aren't many psychiatrists who are willing to speak out, especially after they've seen what's happened to me. And my obligation to my employer to keep the harm to children secret clashes with my obligation and responsibility as a psychiatrist and as a human being to speak out when the care being delivered to children isn't safe and isn't evidence-based.
Well, it would seem as though you have essentially been pushed out. Now, obviously there is some concern elsewhere because this review has now been commissioned. The hospital said earlier in the year that it didn't think there needed to be a review. How did this review come about? I'm
not sure how it came about. It's only just been announced, but unfortunately, it looks like the clinic is just going to be reviewed to see if it's meeting the recommendations of a document that was written by hardline gender activist clinicians and first published back in 2018. And the activist clinicians titled their document "The Australian Standards of Care for Trans and Gender Diverse Children." And the use of Australian standards in the title is a trick to artificially inflate the reliability and reputation of the document, because actually the document has never been officially endorsed apart from by the transgender activist clinician organisation AusPath. And the recommendations in the document aren't underpinned by a systematic review of the research literature. The authors of the document acknowledge that the recommendations are based on the consensus view of a group of AusPath clinicians and underpinned by the position statements of WPATH. So the document is very affirming of children, and it encourages the family and everyone around the child to take an affirming approach. It even recommends that the clinician liaise with the child's kindergarten to promote the child's social transition. It views the kids attending gender clinics as naturally trans and any mental health problems that they're suffering as primarily being due to the stigma of being trans. And the only treatment pathway it talks about is, surprise, surprise, social transition, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and gender surgeries. So I do fear that the Queensland Children's Hospital Gender Clinic is going to pass this review with flying colours. And if that's the case, it's going to be the children and parents of Queensland that lose out.
Well, as you say, I mean, these very guidelines that the hospital will be measured against claim that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormone treatment, surgeries, etc., are life-saving. So, they're basically setting it up to say, OK, well, we've ticked the box, all is good here. But when you look at the way things have gone around the world, as I said before, Tavistock is closing down and it's not the only one. It does feel like the tide is starting to turn a bit. When is that going to reach Australia?
Oh, I really wish that Australians would start getting a bit louder in telling their politicians that they're concerned about the harm to children from the affirmation model. And I just don't think parents realise the extent of the problem, and they don't realise how distressed and powerless they are going to feel if their child develops gender dysphoria, and no matter where they turn, they can only access gender-affirming care.
In terms of this international change, and as I was saying before, the fact that it hasn't happened in Australia, what's driven the change internationally as opposed to not in Australia?
Yeah, it's different for different countries. So, say, for example, in Sweden, there was a media program, the Trans Train, and a lot of very concerned parents of teenagers with the onset of gender dysphoria during the adolescent years that really pushed for change. And then in our other jurisdictions, it's been more of a political response. So it can come from the people or it can come from the government. And actually, in Finland, it came from the doctors. So I wish that would happen, but the doctors in Australia are too scared to speak up. But in Finland, it was the gender clinic doctors that said that they were concerned and asked the government for guidelines.
Well, as a doctor, I think it is your job and your priority to speak up, and thank you for doing so. Dr. Gillian Spencer, Merry Christmas and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now, I spoke the other night with the rest of the Late Debate team about the ailing tradition of leaving a six-pack out for the Garbos. Well, one of our great viewers in Mount Gambier, Barney McCusker, sent me this photo today. He's decided to revive the tradition with some great South Aussie Coopers. Good on you, Barney, and I hope your local garbagemen enjoy it. Well, after the break, hooray! The Albanese government has won the praise of Hamas. Plus, eco-warriors storm an ANZ meeting and start performing circus acts. I didn't make that up. See it for yourself after this. Well, overnight, an unverified video circulated on social media featuring Hamas deputy Ghazi Hamad praising Australia's support for a Gaza ceasefire resolution. I talked about it earlier. Here's what he had to say.
The Hamas movement is watching the growing calls by several Western government to end the aggression on Gaza, the last of which was the statement by Canada, Australia and New Zealand backing sustainable ceasefire in Gaza. We welcome these developments and consider them in the right direction toward isolation the fascist Israeli government.
I mean, this is the same leader who said that the terror group would repeat the October 7 massacre again and again. But Anthony Albanese condemned the video today, so I suppose that makes it all better, doesn't it? Let's bring our panel straight in. Joining me on the desk is Sky News contributor Tina McQueen. Merry Christmas, great to have you here.
Hi, Caleb.
And out of the formerly great state of Victoria, James Bolt, Sky News contributor. How are you, mate?
Very well, thank you.
That's the idea. Now, I mean, come on, Tina. If we are being praised, or not we, I mean you and I certainly aren't going to get the praise of Hamas, but if the Prime Minister and Australia is being praised by Hamas, surely we've gone down the wrong road.
It was certainly a ringing endorsement for Albanese, and he should absolutely be...
Maybe he should go over to Gaza and join Hamas.
Well, he should. I mean, he should have been very firm from the start regarding Israel. So naturally, these comments are going to flow from these terrorist organisations. But it's absolutely disgraceful. I think Peter Dutton came out and absolutely slammed the Prime Minister today. If you're not supporting what is correct and right to do, you're going to leave yourself open for these nut jobs to say what a wonderful job you're doing the foreign policy, which is outrageous. I mean, it's not just Hamas, it's the China as well.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the friends that Albanese's been collecting this week, James, the CCP's all on board because we're not going to send a ship to the Red Sea. Now, you know, we're told by Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, that we have to keep these ships here so that if anything happens in the South China Sea or the Pacific, we've got them. Well, if China is happy that we're not sending a boat over to the Red Sea, they can't be terribly worried that we'd have much to do in the South China Sea or the Pacific either.
Yeah, it just seems to be purchase one measly drone and watch the Australian Navy fall over itself trying to figure out what to do. Richard Marles can say that he wants to keep these ships here in our region to keep us safe, but the rumour is that we don't have the technology to deal with the Houthi rebels' drones, and what I haven't heard from Richard Marles is him saying that that is simply not true. He can send 6 additional Defence Force people all he wants, but America asked for a ship, and I don't think they did ask for 6 people instead.
No, but that's what they've got. I mean, God knows what you do with 6 people, but good luck to you. I think Simon Birmingham put it well today. He said that the Prime Minister should be ashamed of the endorsements his government is receiving from Chinese propaganda to Hamas terrorists. The welcoming of Australian foreign policy decisions is both disturbing and embarrassing. Hear, hear. Now, the ANZ's annual general meeting was in Brisbane yesterday. Was interrupted by a bunch of climate activists dressed up, I'm not joking, as circus performers. Take a look.
We now turn to the bank's actions on climate change, and I'd like to begin.
Welcome to the ANZ Circus, a magical place where climate change doesn't exist.
So I'd like to ask you now
and we
to sit
pour
down.
billions of dollars into fossil fuel projects. Our climate policies are a joke.
I mean, Tina, what is wrong with these people? They just get weirder and weirder by the day.
We're just like living in some strange universe, Caleb. But these corporate giants should learn from The Voice. Stay out of things that you know where you shouldn't have your say. Leave it to policy to dictate. But you know, to comment on climate science and things when they have no right. When the general public, it affects it's not fair to the shareholders of these companies. It's ridiculous. Stay in your own lane. Banking and finance, if that's what it is, and just ignore these clowns.
Well, it'd be a great idea, but you know, they've got to get those ESG points, James. But I mean, I think I've described these stupid protesters before gluing themselves to the road and whatever as a clown show. It turns out I was right.
They were listening to you, Caleb.
I'd say a point I would make to protesters, if you're going to dress up as clowns and make serious points about Australia's climate future, I'd designate one person to dress normally, because if you dress as a circus performer or a clown, no one's going to take you seriously if you are trying to make a serious point. I thought one of the circus performers said something quite interesting I want to quote here. They said that many Australians expect companies, including banks, to consider the environmental impacts of the decisions we make, and that ANZ has an important role in energy transition. Sorry, that wasn't one of the circus performers. That was ANZ Chairman Paul O'Sullivan. And I think that just goes to Tina's point, that the problem is now that you don't just have the protesters in the stands doing the clown show, you know, chasing that high from the time in year 10 that they were a tree in a school production. You also have their ideology on stage, and that's when Australia really has a problem.
Oh, my goodness. We're going to hell in a handbasket. You may as well put those protesters in charge, to be perfectly honest. Now, this is a serious issue, just sort of moving on a little bit. Shaun Michaels-Dunk was released from hospital in South Australia on Monday after receiving treatment for a mental health condition. He'd been subject to an inpatient treatment order, so he was forced to be in hospital. But 2 days later, he allegedly stabbed a woman who was unknown to him. The SA Health Minister, Chris Picton, was asked 3 times yesterday whether the health system might have failed her, but referred to a pending independent review to decide.
We will leave no stone unturned in having a proper independent look at this matter, and I think that's what everyone across the state would expect at this time.
Now, look, obviously we don't know the guilt of this fellow. That will all come out in due course. But in these cases where people, for their own good and the good of others, have been locked up under mental health grounds, I feel like in some cases now that as a society and as governments and police and whatever, we feel like we can't do that when it might be the best thing to do.
But Caleb, you don't need a review. I mean, this is ridiculous. Clearly the health system has let both these people down. It's a very, very sad situation. But it really annoys me when these politicians came out and say, oh, we need a review or it's being looked at closely. That, by the time the review is conducted, it's 12 months down the track and everyone's forgot about it. No, this needs attention now so that it doesn't happen again. So if there are further patients that require more care or be taken, looked after more closely, they should do it. Don't wait 12 months for an impending review to hand down what they think that the problem was. We all know what the problem is.
Yeah, and the mental health system entirely is just broken. I mean, it is as much of an issue as physical health.
Yes.
And it just doesn't seem to get the same sort of attention. Now, very quickly, a cardiac research institute has released data that supposedly shows excessive traffic noise in Sydney has a negative effect on heart health, increasing the risk of stroke. James, you live in Sydney. Are you worried about the state of your heart because there are cars whizzing down the road?
Yeah, living next to loud noises constantly can be frustrating and stressful. More breathtaking research from the University of Durr. I'll tell you what, I'm really hoping that this report doesn't end up in the hands of some of our politicians who might take this as an excuse or to lower street noise, to lower traffic noise by bringing in 30-kilometre-an-hour zones, which is good for absolutely no one's stress and no one's heart health.
Oh, God, we know. Don't give them ideas. We know councils love to do this sort of stuff. James Bolt, Tina McQueen.
Caleb, they've got to suck it up, buttercups. Noise happens.
Get over it. Get over it. This is life, eh? Merry Christmas to you both. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
All right, after the break, we'll head to London where Rishi Sunak's leadership is hanging by a thread, plus a children's show owned by a former Playboy CEO. Now, how could that go wrong? You'll find out after this. Well, UK PM Rishi Sunak's leadership is in shambles. The Rwanda bill left his leadership hanging by a thread, and now he faces yet another Tory rebellion over his plans to introduce a net zero boiler tax to fast-track the switch to heat pumps. Let's head to London, where writer and broadcaster Esther Kraku can tell us all about it. Esther, what is it with these Conservative leaders that keep coming up with ideas that Conservative voters won't take to?
Well, I think you've just highlighted the main issue here, which is that the Conservative leaders are not actually Conservative. And this is the problem that we face. There's a huge sort of gap between the parliamentary parties that we have and what the people that typically vote for them actually want. This is one of the reasons why clearly Rishi Sunak lost the leadership contest to Liz Truss, because he's so disconnected from his party's base and from what the party actually want. You have the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, which is a group made of about 50 backbench MPs, Tory backbench MPs, asking, if heat pumps are as good as you say they are, why do you feel the need to mandate them? This is a man who is saying that he wasn't going to allow, an unpragmatic way to reach net zero. He wasn't going to allow net zero to bankrupt families, but he's going to allow net zero to bankrupt businesses because of talks of this plan to effectively penalise businesses that don't meet, or boiler businesses that don't meet the heat pump installation measures. The prices have gone up by over £120. So he's actually hurting the consumer as well, and he doesn't seem to understand that. The embarrassing thing about this policy, which he seems to be going ahead with, is the fact that he would have to rely on the opposition to get it through, because Labour have already said that they're going to back this measure. So that begs the question, what is the difference between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party? Who will we be voting for if the Tory leader has to rely on Labour MPs to get through unpopular policies with the Tories?
It's a very similar question here and in other parts of the world, I think. But, Sunak already made this sort of a surprise announcement that he's going to have a 2024 election instead of January 2025. What's he got to gain in bringing it forward if he's already on the slide?
I mean, I think it's more about looking at what the calendar would possibly look like. So we obviously know 2024 is going to be quite the year for politics. The American elections are going to happen in November, and the EU elections are also going to be taking place. And he really has to time it properly. If he leaves it late until January 2025, there's so many things that could go wrong, particularly after winter when people are not in the best mood. The sun doesn't shine. I mean, I'm sure you can see behind me the sun finally decided to make an appearance here in London. But you know, there's so many things that could go wrong with leaving it as late as possible. He has to get the timing just right. And there's also the reality, the looming reality, that there's very little Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party can do to stave off a complete wipeout. I think they've just accepted their fate. The problem we're now having is really, doesn't matter who you vote for, you're effectively getting the same party if the leader of the Conservative Party has to rely on Labour MPs to get through legislation.
You should come down to Australia, Esther. I mean, we had storms last week and floods and all sorts, but we've got some lovely sunshine out at the moment. Now, there's a new kids show on Netflix called Coco Melon Lane. It's raised a few eyebrows. Now, this show was recently purchased by two former Disney execs, one of them Kevin Mayer, who was the CEO of Playboy, of all things, in 2000. And both remain close with Bob Iger, who's turned the Disney, woke as its CEO over there. Now this show has been in the top 10 on Netflix in the US for 5 weeks. So it's quite popular, but a few weeks in, they have a boy dancing around in a tutu and tiara for his gay dads. Have a look at this.
How about you break out those moves for your 2 biggest fans?
I mean, seriously, Esther, could they make it any more obvious?
This is the thing. Whenever people like us point out that there may be some sort of plan going on here, some sort of agenda being pushed, we're called conspiracy theorists. I mean, it doesn't get much clearer than this. This is the most popular show amongst the 2+ age group, and yet you have this young boy dressed as a girl dancing for his 2 gay dads. A scenario that would realistically happen 0.001% of the time, right? For some reason, this is being normalized to children. And when parents raise concerns, when parents actually push for alternative forms of media where they don't have to effectively sit with their children and monitor everything they watch because they're scared of the kinds of things that they're being fed, we're told that we're bigots and that we're discriminating against this normal family setup.
I've neglected to mention as well that the dads are gay, but one of them is black as well. So, they've got all the bases.
Yeah, exactly. You have to tick.
So,
I mean, the last thing, they just need to be Muslim and have crutches and have some other form of disability, and you've ticked all the boxes. What also happens if the kid asks how he was born?
Sorry, say that again?
What happens if their young son asks how he came about? Yeah. They say that he was hatched
well,
from an egg?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. But we don't want to touch these things on these shows, do we? It's all happy, lovely, weird sort of world we're living in. Now, I don't know where all this started, but I keep seeing tweets about Pierce Brosnan's wife. And now he, of course, was a Bond, much better looking Bond than I am. But they're supposedly suggesting that some women let themselves go during marriage, comparing 2 pictures of Keely Shea Smith a decade apart, having a go at her like she's turned into some kind of slob. But I have to say, all I see is a beautiful woman in both shots and a couple that are happily married and in love. And I think it's almost like the male version of feminism, where these idiots start to blindly hate the opposite sex. We've only got 30 seconds, Esther, but what is the point here?
Well, I mean, I think the account that posted this ridiculous tweet probably tells more about the philosophy behind these people than anything else. This was from an anon tweet, someone that we don't know. We don't know their face. We don't know if they're married. We don't know if they've had the honour of being married to a woman that's given them 2 kids, like Pierce Brosnan has. But you've just nailed it on the head. They're just as toxic as modern feminism, and their goal is to keep people apart and miserable. And they're not going to win, unfortunately, because people don't want to be all alone.
Esther Kraku, thank you so much for your time. Merry Christmas. Well, that's it from me. I hope you have a Merry Christmas. I'll be off for a couple of weeks now. I'll be back same time, same place on January the 8th. Have a wonderful time. Gemma Tognini is up now with the Rita Panahi Show.